Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Docomomo UK. We are having an extra talk in February this month because we decided that the chance to ask John Puttick and CHRISTINA Malathouni to come and talk about Preston Bus Station and its restoration, its saving and its restoration was too good an opportunity to miss. So tonight, I'm delighted they're here in person to talk about how this landmark building, which was threatened with demolition recently, was able to be firstly listed and then through an amazing competition saved and restored completely for full community use. Tonight, we're going to talk firstly about the listing process, and then John is going to take us through some of the key issues around the restoration of this amazing building. And if you're not familiar with it, it basically came out of the stable of BDP, which produced some of probably some of the most memorable buildings in the post-war catalogue, including buildings such as the Halifax Building Society headquarters, the other side of the Pennines from this building, and a whole host of other buildings. I think the key to this is the joined up thinking between restoration, listing, and reuse, which I think this little project has successfully succeeded in doing. Anyway, without further ado, but actually, could I just ask, before we start the presentation, would everyone mind muting themselves so we haven't got any unwelcome interruptions during the talk? Thank you. So I'll say a little bit about CHRISTINA. She's a lecturer at Liverpool University, formerly of caseworker at 20th Century Society, and she was the instrument, or she was instrumental in getting the listing going and getting the necessity of saving this building on the agenda. John is a young architect who has only really been in practice since 2014, and within a year of getting going, successfully won the competition for the restoration of this building, and I think is now mainly as a result of that able to focus on restoration projects, principally in the public sector. Without further ado then, I think it would be the best thing to introduce CHRISTINA to tell us a little bit about the building, its ruinous state, and how the listing process went. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will just kick off with the slides. It will be a very quick tour through a number of images, but both John and I have said we can take questions at the end, so I will race through them, and if anything is not clear, we're more than happy to come back to them. So let's share my screen. Oops, that's something wrong. And I hope that's full screen now. Before I forget, I have not got permission from Michael Mackenzie to use this picture for this presentation. I got permission to use it many years ago, but I love the photograph still. So I just make sure I point out that that's a copyright image by Michael Mackenzie, and you can look up his work on Preston Bus Station, which is just fantastic. So straight ahead, I'll start with congratulating John, because that's the opportunity they won with the World Monuments Fund, the Noel Modernism Prize. And as you may have heard, they're also shortlisted for Civic Trust Award. I'm going to mention all the other awards they've already put under the belt for the building, but I thought we should start with that because that's the opportunity now for discussing Preston again. And now I'm going to turn back in time. So I will very briefly introduce the building. I will then, most of you, I would imagine, joining a DOCOMOMO event, you know about the National Heritage System, but I'll mention some key points that were really crucial for what happened with Preston. Then I'll show effectively a timeline with a few images on how the listing saga unfolded. And then I also have, that's where there's a little bit of disparity with the succession of presentations. I'm going to jump ahead and tell you about some things that happened after the refurbishment by John, but then John is going to be filling in the gaps in his presentation. So the building, as we've already had, has been quite successful and popular even while it was being designed. BDP was very, high-rising, very, very ambitious and fascinating firm. So you can see here, even before it was built, it already started winning awards. 1967, we had this AD Project Award. And you can see in the photograph, Keithingham and John Wilson there, Charles Wilson, the two project architects. I'm sure you're all familiar with the building. This is the most fascinating and most famous in terms of its architectural features, the curved elevations, where the car park is on the top floors. And of course, the split section, you can see here, the top left one, wonderful drawings as well of the time. It caught the attention as soon as it was completed. You can see here in Ian Nance in his travels, he really had the building featuring in one of his films for Bolton and Preston. And I love this zooming in as they were filming, you can see and sort of shrinking at the back. But if we now jump to what happens with designation, of course, you know, the National Heritage List for England is where you can find everything that's protected by law. It doesn't just include buildings. Preston, in this case, of course, it's a listed building at the present, but there are a range of different heritage assets. I've listed here the wreck sites, battlefields, parks and gardens, scheduled monuments, and of course, we also go beyond the statutory designation at national level. We have local designation, which is not as strong as national statutory designation, but we also have World Heritage Sites, which are international level. The key thing that applies in terms of listing is that anyone can propose a building for listing. Looking into post-war buildings was something that came into action quite late in the 1990s, starting a little bit earlier with buildings after 1939. But what happens at present, we have the 30-year rule, which means a building needs to be 30 years old. There are exceptions if it's at risk or of outstanding interest, so eligible for grade 1 or grade 2 star. This doesn't apply to Preston here, but it's just the general picture. Historic England are the government's advice on the historic environment, but the final decision is taken by a minister. So it's a political decision. What happens in reality is this final approval of the listing decision is usually just a technicality. But there can be controversial cases, so ministers can object, and this is what has been happening with Preston twice before its final decision where the building got listed. And it is very common, not exclusively, but very common that post-war buildings attract more controversy in terms of the listings being objected by politicians. This is an old slide, it's from 2012, but I can't imagine the figures changing too much. And the reason I don't have a more recent slide is Historic England are incredibly effective with the management of their website, so you can't even take screenshots anymore. So I keep these very precious images. So again, you can see the post-war listings are a very thin line here. So they're really the lowest percentage of protected buildings. You are, of course, attending an event organized by DOCOMOMO, so you know the work that DOCOMOMO is doing. But of course, there are a number of other initiatives that look into 20th century architectural heritage, both international and national. So English Heritage as it used to be. Historic England now has taken these initiatives quite early on. 20th Century Society at bottom left has been instrumental in this listing, and is precisely its remit is the National Mean Society with its remit for post-1914 architecture. And of course, you can see ICOMOS has initiatives on modern architecture, UNESCO in general, more broadly, the World Monuments Fund that gave the recent award, recent prize. Key in terms of how listings take place, there are broadly the criteria for architectural or historic interest, and then there are general principles, and some of these are listed here. So national interest, selectivity, aesthetic merits, age and rarity, and the one that's been cut off, I'm going to come back to it. So this is not the complete list. In addition to that, there are specific selection guides, and usually these are by typology, so different type buildings, and there's more historical research about significant developments in different areas. So going now to the campaign, so it was effectively a 15-year campaign, because with the post-war, you can see the bottom left picture where we have the English Heritage post-1939 listing program. What they did thematic surveys, and this is this one where Preston was included already by 1998, was for road transport buildings. So following this, it's identified as a very special building that should be considered for listing. And by September 2000, there's a gap there because I've never managed to find the full details. But by September 2000, I know that the 20th Century Society was supporting a listing put forward by what was then English Heritage. Clearly, this didn't go ahead because by August 2001, we already have the first review request, which again, 20th Century Society is supporting, because we had the first time that the minister objected to what English Heritage was recommending. So we have already a first review request, which doesn't go ahead. So the building remains unlisted. This first attempt is unsuccessful. Controversies already on the plate, not only because of the decision, but also you can see some early press clippings here, where we've got the listing round for the building, and there are different positions taken. It already also attracts architectural journalists' attention. Jonathan Clancy already writing in 2007, and he names the building a Baroque cathedral for buses. So there is a long period where things go a little bit quiet. There is a regeneration scheme going ahead, and it's under that the building is under threat. So by late 2008, there was a discussion within the 20th Century Society that there was enough time from the previous listing application, so another attempt would be quite the right thing to do. So by January 2009, that's the point where I've started working for them, and this is my first involvement with the building. So by January 2009, we submit a new listing application. It takes quite a while, and it's only by the end of the year that English Heritage recommends again listing at grade 2. But very quickly, DCMS comes back within a month and rejects again the recommendation. And then within 2 months, a second review request is submitted by 20th Century Society. Up in Preston, the discussion again sort of awakens. So we have one of the local newspapers, Lancashire Evening Post, doing a survey about which is the favorite building of the city, and Bus Station is voted the favorite building. Of course, that's not a uniform opinion. I mean, there are objections still. And within, it takes about a year to get a decision on the review request. But in the meantime, just a month before we hear, the month before we hear the decision, 20th Century Society also nominates British Brutalism as a whole, with 3 good examples for the World Monuments Watch List for 2012. And that's interesting as well with the prize now, that there is a long history with World Monuments Fund as well, an interest in the building. 1st of April, and I find this very, very ironic that it's the 1st of April, DCMS decision on the review request comes back and it's rejected again. The same month, one of these listing selection guides is being published, a new version for transport buildings. So 30th of April 2011, and Preston, so Historic England is definitely supporting the building fully. This is one they were never in two minds about. They were always very supportive of the building, and it features very prominently in the selection guide about transport buildings. July 2011, the regeneration contract expires, and interestingly enough, there's a shortlist for the Sterling Prize for 2011, and we already have by this time schemes shortlisted for an architecture, for the main architecture prize in the UK, where we have refurbished buildings included, one listed and one not listed. And I always find this blog entry I wrote for C20 quite interesting, because I rediscovered it a couple of years ago, and I thought, look, I'm a prophet, because at that point I was just half jokingly, half seriously saying, could at one day the building go back and be targeting a Sterling Prize, which became history a few years later. So it takes a few more months to hear the outcome of the World Monuments Watch nominations, and it is successful. So October 2011, we have British Brutalism put in the 2012 World Monuments Watch. Just a month later, things in Preston change again, the same direction that the scheme has effectively collapsed, the regeneration scheme. John Lewis pulls out, and there's more pressure from the society to the city centre, to the city council, that there are other options that they should consider for the building, and this may be, an opportunity in disguise. But at the same time, BDP starts celebrating their first 50 years, and they have an online vote. Bus Station is voted the second favourite building, and all the rest of them are much more recent buildings. So it's the only building from their first decade, effectively, that gets voted in the first top 10 buildings. February 2012, although Preston City Council were saying they will consider other options, they do vote against the referendum on the future of the building. So it's always up and down. April 2012, a very interesting image, a very interesting event. BBC celebrates celebrate their Easter program up in Preston. They have Preston Passion, and that already this image and all the events that took place there demonstrate what a number of people were saying about how much potential the building and its siding and the surrounding space has for the whole city centre, that it can be seen with fresh eyes. More events happening from local initiatives. So in certain places who have been instrumental as well later in celebration for the 50th anniversary, they ran this symposium, and a number of myself and people from Preston, we were all there again, supporting the different positions. And that's the time where it's critical for the third listing application, because at the same time, I proposed to 20th Century Society, should we do a small publication on the building? And I put in a research funding application to the RIBA. I didn't get that. It got shortlisted, but I didn't get that. But still, I was still in London at the time. So I went to the BDP archive in London, and I started digging out some more material. And that's exactly where it struck me, because I started looking at a lot of publicity about the use of glass reinforced polyester, which I had never seen until then, not in any research I did for the first listing application, not in anything English Heritage had done up to that point. So that struck me and stayed with me. This publication in particular, Concrete and GRP. So this is by BDP, and it's really striking how they see concrete, which we all identify with the building, on the same level as GRP. In their eyes, they were the two materials that made the building. So there's more in different sort of newspapers. There's the company that produced the material and all the little fittings or the molds for the concrete. Of course, they show the building as a very special case study to promote their product. And you can see how many different applications it had. So there are also the signage, there's a kiosk for car park tickets, the big wonderful arrows. So it did play a key role in the building, including the molds for all the concrete elements that were prefabricated. At the same time, there were a few articles that were suggesting this was quite new for the UK setting, not internationally, so the material was already quite advanced, but still it did have a national significance, and it was the early days of these applications in the building industry. So I'll skip that one. It's similar. I mean, there are some of these applications, the company carried on a new line of products even after the bus station. So all this material is just sitting in my computer. I'm not doing anything with it. The funding hasn't gone through beyond, it didn't go beyond shortlisting, so it's just sitting. And that's also the time I'm moving from the 20th century up to Liverpool for an academic job. And then there is this RIBA journal where issue where Hugh Pearman is interviewing the new minister, and he asks the critical question, what about Preston? Because of the World Monuments Fund, he picks from that and says, what about Preston? Shouldn't it be listed? And what I've highlighted there is the answer where he says, but to be clear, I think it was rejected in 2010 and a review of the decision was turned down in 2011. So it's unlikely to come up for listing anytime soon. For me, it's clear cut what happens next. The minister says it can't be listed. Within the next month, Preston City Council comes back and says it's going to be demolished and it's going to be replaced by a smaller building. I don't think anyone is going to accuse me of libel. I don't think the two events are not connected. I think they're directly connected. I do remember very strongly, even hugely experienced people in the sector were resigned at that point. They thought, that's it, we've lost the building, it's going to go. And that's where I go back to 20th Century Society and say, look, I have this material, I never processed it, but it caught my eye. Should I just give it another shot? And of course they said yes. So again, all the press is watching that. Again, you see the RIBA latest issue, All Eyes on Preston. I put the listing application together. We submitted right after Christmas. For some reason, I write about Preston over Christmas. It may help in some way. It's submitted within a month. English Heritage confirms that the listing case is reopened. And they do make it clear this is very unusual with less than 5 years from the previous one, but it's because there is new material that hasn't been considered in previous attempts. So they can, this counts as an exception and they can reopen the case within a shorter period of time. They circulate the circulation report, the consultation report, and April, they announced that they have received a certificate of immunity from listing, which is the best. We always assumed that was the City Council. I don't remember if it was ever openly confirmed, but again, it's a safe assumption to say that. So that's where the critical thing, which I didn't mention earlier, is in terms of selection of listing buildings, that the state of repair shouldn't be considered when a building is assessed for listing. And this was one of the arguments that was being put forward a lot with the case against listing. So it took several months to get the final decision. There was a lot of activity up in Preston in many different ways. So one of the events that was really, really important in terms of public support was this Gate 81 event, both in May and in June. There were different events. The May event was at the bus station with a lot of activities and the public involved and everybody else. I will pause here for a second, and this is just screenshots from the Facebook page that's called Save Preston Bus Station, because I'm talking about myself, I'm talking about the 20th Century Society. The reality is there were so many actors in this campaign that continuously supported the building. I don't know all of them. I don't think anyone, and most of us didn't even know each other. But the Facebook page was really a focal point where a lot of initiatives were coming together. There were a lot of art projects. This is again a very small sample. So the building has a very special position in many people's hearts. So now I'll speed up because I've taken a lot of time. Eventually we're here, September 23rd, the building gets listed. You can see here BBC Lancashire features the case. It's added to the National Heritage List for England. You can see that the GRP, this is a very brief summary, there's more text in the list. It's mentioned in passing. The GRP didn't get the building listing as such. The case was already there. What it did, it reopened the case at a time that would not be possible to reopen because of the limited time from the previous attempt. Already international interest, not just the World Monument Fund, ICOMOS. I presented the case. It had been accepted even before the positive result. That was normally a conference for World Heritage Sites, and yet they accepted a Grade 2 listed case because it was so controversial. More interest, the building features, you can see here, Jonathan Meach is doing more of his programs, and it features again here. Excellent news, the whole campaign, it focused on the Facebook page because it was the focal point, but of course there were a number of people that not everybody is known, and it wins the Heritage Alliance Heroes Award in December 2014. Again, more international interest. We published an article with the whole story of the listing, and that was in a journal that normally focuses in Australia and New Zealand. John is going to fill in the gaps here because this is what he's going to talk about. So we've got the competition to refurbish the building. He wins the competition, he deals with that. But I love this line from the Lancashire County Council leader when the refurbishment is finished and is completed, and he says, thankfully it was listed, which is a wonderful change of approach to what the building is, from a burden to a real asset as it truly is. 2019, a wonderful year full of awards. So we have 4 RIBA awards, which I predicted 8 years earlier. Another award through the RTAPI for Heritage and Culture Award. And then in autumn, we had some really major events. The University of London, I organized a conference, cross-sector conference between architects and conservation people. And then up in Preston, we had, for those of you who missed it, I'm really sorry for you. It was a wonderful event, a massive exhibition, excellent exhibition. So again, a lot of international interest. So in our event in London, we included the 20th Century Society, of course, English Heritage, but also World Monuments Fund Britain. We had Angela Brady, who was very much involved as well in the campaign. ICOMOS, the International Scientific Committee for 20th Century Getty Conservation Institute. We were super happy. It was amazing. We had Charles Wilson, who actually came to the event and talked about the building, a special treat. We had a little bit of coverage in press. I had many more images from the exhibition up in Preston, but I removed them just to keep it brief. But it was a truly fantastic event. The material was just absolutely amazing, and it did cover more than just the building and the architecture. As the title said, there was an interest in the life of the building. You can see here some of the construction with the GRP, all the different facets of PDP's work, which was clearly from typography to you name it, everything. And again, as I said, the life in the building and contemporary art, more contemporary art. And this is all from the exhibition. It took over the Harris Museum throughout. And this was the event. There was also a one-day symposium. The 2 curators, they need credit because they were excellent. And some pictures that we're taking at the spur of the moment, but they are very, very wonderful memento from the event. Of course, in my current job, because universities need to show how their research relates to the world beyond academia, we are featuring Preston Bus Station as one of our impact case study for research excellence framework. And something that relates to Dr. Moment directly. I've written a small article with a story about GRP for one of the special issues of the journal that are coming out. It was delayed because of COVID, but I've been told it's coming out on architectural plastics. And that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Christina. John, can I introduce you now, please?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Christina, and many thanks, John. It's really good to be at this event with Dr. Momo. So let me share my screen. Okay. Hopefully everybody's got that. So I'll just talk a little bit about the building at the beginning before moving on to the competition stage of the project and then the actual refurbishment project as it was carried out. Christina's talked a bit about this already. The building designed by BDP opened in 1969. This is a fantastic postcard from when the building first opened, proudly declaring the building the largest of its kind in Britain, which it still is today. And I think this is the side of the bus station that people really know if you haven't been to Preston, this kind of heroic brutalist monument, the very large scale, the sweeping curving parapets and the parade of the columns as it goes along there. And it is an incredible building. Even I can't imagine in 1969, but even today, as you move through the city, it's a real surprise as you get to the bus apron and it really opens up, explodes in front of you. And again, Christina talked already about the innovation around prefabrication, the use of GRP molds to create these incredible sort of curving forms, both in the parapets and the ramps that spiral around at the two ends of the building. I think if you haven't been to Preston, the interior and the human scale of the project is something you'd be perhaps less familiar with. But it's something that we were very interested in from the beginning of our work, even at the competition stage, visiting the building. BDP's stated intention in the original design was to try and raise the status of a bus station to the glamour of an airport. It may not feel that airports are so glamorous now, but I think you can see in the renderings that they made at the time really those intentions. And they had this concept of integrated design from the largest scale of the structure all the way down through signage, the furniture, the handrails, everything integrated and part of one coherent design. If you look at early pictures after the building opened, it's maybe slightly less glamorous than the rendering, but I think you can see all of those ideas really if you flick between the two, even the way the clocks are, the way the signage is, the kind of sweep of the layers of the concrete modules above your head, everything's really there. Everything was seen through in the design of the building. And Christine has shown some of these images already, but coming down to these sort of smaller GRP elements, even the typography used throughout the project, the use of timber in different places, I'll come in a little while. If you look at the plan of the building, you can see it's a very rigorous building. Actually, Charles Wilson, that came up in the earlier presentation, one of the original architects, told me that a lot of the setting out of the structure was really devised around the car park grid. And essentially they started with the car park floors, looking at the module of a car, which set out the structural grid, which was then projected down to the ground floor. And you can see how in the original building, you had bus parking on both sides, really surrounding the building. And then all the way down the east and west sides, glass facade and waiting areas, and then the spine of accommodation that runs almost the whole length of the building, and a number of ramps into subways. Somebody told me that in the section originally, the parapets were simply straight concrete upstands, and that was found to be too heavy. And it was actually the engineer, Arup, that came up with this kind of curving parapets as a structurally lighter solution. I don't know if that's actually true, but when you review the older drawings, you certainly see a sudden change at some point in the design, and these curving forms come into place. And looking at the construction details, Lancashire County Council, who were the client for the project, gave us whole set of BDP construction drawings, and they're fascinating to look through and really very beautiful in themselves. In this case, the engineering drawing for those curved parapets, which are essentially precast modules that then had an in situ concrete topping done on site. And again, similarly, those curving ramps that spiral around at the end of the building, really quite an extraordinary set of drawings. For the construction process, there was actually a factory, almost a factory, a kind of production line set up on the site because the site was so large and the scale of the building so big, so they could directly cast the concrete in GRP molds on the site. So coming forward in time to the time of the competition in 2015, the building was still operational, of course, still working as a bus station, still working as a car park, but in considerably less glamorous state of repair than it had been envisaged in the 60s. I think the fortunate side of the project in many ways was that the original materials were all incredibly robust and were all still there below the surface, but they'd become very much cluttered up, sort of profusion of signage everywhere. Things were over painted in all kinds of different colors. A new lighting scheme had been installed at some point, which somehow made the place feel more gloomy, I think. All kinds of sort of strange seating and things around. The double height facade that surrounds the ground floor, the main bus station concourse itself, was in particularly bad repair. And in fact, after we won the competition, a few months later, part of it collapsed in high winds. The aluminium was essentially mill finished and degraded and broke down. But probably the biggest issue on a kind of larger scale was that the building reflected a kind of 60s view of transport planning, I think, where the vehicle took priority over the pedestrian. So the buses were surrounding the building, there's bus parking all around the building, and as a pedestrian trying to get in there, you either had to take one of several underpasses or walk across a bridge. Invariably, people didn't really want to do that, certainly not by 2015. So they were taking their chances by running across the bus waiting area itself, and therefore temporary fencing was erected, and the whole thing is sort of becoming this kind of island cut off from the city centre. Lancashire County Council held an open design competition. It was open to architects all around the world, and the competition was held in two stages. There was an initial round where architects were asked just to put forward some very simple ideas. And then they shortlisted, I think, 5 or possibly 6 teams to go on to do a more detailed second stage. Both stages were anonymous, so the whole competition was judged entirely on the merits of the submission itself. And there were 3 key components to the project at the competition stage. The first was to refurbish the bus station. The second was to create a new public space that would connect the bus station to the centre of Preston and the High Street. And the third was for a youth centre, which would be a new build building. And in the competition, it was asked to be connected to the existing building. At the competition stage, our design focused on refurbishing the bus station and creating the new public square to the west of the city centre that would allow it to connect through to Fishergate, which is the high street, and ultimately the train station, as part of a shared space pedestrian initiative that Lancashire County Council and Preston City Council were carrying out. And we envisaged the youth zone being consolidated as far north as possible and being as efficient as possible in order to free up the maximum amount of public space. And conceptually, we saw the building as there's a number of kind of existing satellites in the 1960s design, the most obvious example being the taxi rank to the south. And we envisaged the youth centre being another of those satellites in a way. The competition was really comprehensively run, and we were asked to make submissions. Our submission had to include information about how we'd sort of look after future maintenance of the buildings, how we'd approach public consultation, the approach to the heritage of the existing building. Is really quite a complicated submission. When we won, it was actually quite controversial, I think mainly focused on the youth centre, which everybody really seemed to fixate on that one aspect of the project rather than the project as a whole. And therefore, the kind of early start of the project was quite lively one for us, and there was a lot of debate about it in the media. Over time, the design of the youth centre evolved, essentially because connecting the new structure to the listed building was a very complicated thing to do. It proving to be very costly, and everybody felt that it made more sense to ultimately separate them out. And that allowed us to create a revised design. There was this sort of volume, stepping volumes, creating a breathing space with the existing building. And essentially the concept was that the new building would step back in massing to respond to the bus station in the way it cantilevered out. Again, that's something that people tend to focus on, that the design changed a lot. But from our point of view, our approach to restoring the bus station really remained the same, and also our approach to the kind of urban design point of view, the creation of the new public square and how we designed those things. The youth centre did get planning permission and was quite close to being built. However, essentially due to kind of political changes in the council, that didn't go ahead at the time. We're now looking actually at the youth centre again on a different site that will face onto the public square, but not be right next to the bus station. So I'm very much hoping that might come together, because it'd be a great opportunity for young people of the city, and perhaps a little more sensitive by being further away from the original building. Anyway, we'll skip on now to the project as it was carried out. So this is the bus station within the centre of Preston. I've turned it 90 degrees now, so north is sort of to the left there. And as I say, you can really see here how the bus parking cut the building off almost as a sort of island site within the fabric of the city. So the kind of master planning, the wider scale of the project, is to create this new public square, which has now been finished. It was finished in 2019. Which connects the west side of the building through to the city centre. And this has been largely pedestrianised. The road here now is only available for buses and taxis. So there's a very kind of much calmer space within the city, where we used to have bus parking on all of this side of the building. It's now a very large urban space, a buffer of trees, but essentially kept free as a large space that could be used for events or in a number of different ways. And then as we approached the building was reorganized to reflect that same idea, that instead of simply having buses all around and a uniform approach to how people use the building, instead now there's this pedestrianized public space outside, and as you come into the building, there's a series of waiting areas, seating, along this side of the building, where before there were purely standing pens, and you kind of gradually filter through to the bus gate and beyond that way. And you can see that now in the kind of 3D diagram. We also tried to open up some spaces within this spine of accommodation, so the two sides of the building communicate with each other. It's more intuitive to find your way around. There's a central ticket space and so on, so that the building's just kind of more fluid and easier to use, and critically, as I say, connects off for the pedestrian to become really part of the city centre. You can see the comparison there. The plan at the bottom is the original drawing, and the plan at the top is the drawing after the refurbishment. So there's also creation of some new facilities to try and bring the building up to the needs of a bus station in the 21st century. In terms of creating a new 24-hour coach station, a new build pod that brings a reception area for the first time. Quite surprisingly, for a building of this size, there was no information point or reception. There's back of house facilities, toilets, baby changing, all kinds of facilities that people would expect to use today. And what we tried to do is really bring around this change of organisation, because I think the building has, the way you move through it and the way you use it as a member of the public is quite different now to how it was before. We tried to bring that around by not conflicting with the original concepts of the design, but instead to use it to try and celebrate those and subtly fit in with the original design. And I have to say, Lancashire County Council were an extraordinary client. That was always their view, that the building should become the best transport hub it could be. There's 10,000 bus departures every week from the building. It's incredibly busy. And I think that they were really supportive of that approach. So if we look specifically at some of the restoration work that was carried out, there was a whole package of concrete repairs done. You can see here there's sort of different types of concrete in the building, from the smooth curving parapets cast in the GRP to these very massive columns with exposed aggregate that were cast in situ. A lot of that was in gradually poorer shape, mostly due to corrosion of the reinforcement bars. I should give credit to Cassidy and Ashton, a architectural practice based in Preston, who worked with us and was responsible for a lot of the concrete repairs and other works of the car park. So all of these kind of repairs were gradually patched up and solved to clean up the building, and also in a kind of very careful way so that it wouldn't disrupt the variety of ways in which the concrete was used around the site. A second major element of the refurbishment works was the concourse facade, this double height facade that surrounds the entire ground floor of the building. And as I mentioned earlier, it started to degrade and some of it fell down. We all felt that the original design was really important to the atmosphere of the space, particularly the sort of transparency between the outside and the inside, and even the proportions, the way you had the larger proportions on the ground floor, this horizontal band, which is actually blue in color in the original design, and then this sort of smaller proportion of the upper part of the facade. And also the way numbering, the middle of band there was used to bring numbering, to bring speakers for the PA system and a number of other things, as a really kind of sensitive and clever original design element. Somewhat surprisingly, amongst the hundreds of BDP drawings, there was pretty much just this one that seemed to cover the entire facade. So we spent quite a lot of time trying to dissect this and understand it. And we also worked very closely with 20th Century Society, who obviously CHRISTINA spoke about. They were involved as a statutory consultee throughout the design process, and we engaged ourselves, and Lancashire County Council engaged very closely with them. Which I think is probably one of the successes of the building, the interrogation of the design of the refurbishment with them. The ground floor doors was a point of particular discussion. They were built in the 60s as timber framed glass doors. Certainly in 2015, and I suspect for a long time before, all of the doors were either kind of stuck in an open or closed position because they were incredibly heavy. And it simply wasn't something that worked well as a modern bus station. So ultimately the entire facade was rebuilt. It was really past repair, with the exception of the structural member that's behind the horizontal band. And on the ground floor, we replaced the original doors with aluminium, but anodized with a bronze finish to the frame that gives a sort of color palette and a warmth that reflects the timber. But otherwise, this was really a kind of quite careful sort of recreation of the original facade. We looked at the original mullion proportions and design, which is sort of T-shape in section for the upper part of the facade, slightly increased the depth of it to meet modern wind load standards, but otherwise it's a fairly faithful representation of what was there before. And on the inside, we have this central band that was originally in the 60s backlit all the way around, which we've reinstated, which makes a huge difference to the interiors. One thing that is interesting working on a building of this era, this sort of exposed concrete brutalist structure, is that it simply doesn't give you many places to hide. If you're trying to introduce new systems to a building, there's not layers of plasterboard that you can put cabling and ducts behind. So we ultimately used this middle band of the facade almost as a kind of tube for which we would deliver different services, CCTV, the PA system, information, lighting, and so on, all the way around the building, in order to be able to do that without disrupting the original concrete surfaces. And you can see some photographs of the reinstated facade there, both from the outside, the three-dimensional signage now reflecting the new organization of the building, and also on the inside. And there was actually quite a lot of debate about the use of signage inside, what level to which branding and so on could be introduced. But again, the client, I think, was very very strong in backing the idea of keeping the coherence of the building and reinstating the original design proposals, which is what you can see today. The third aspect of the project, really the final one to talk about, is the interior refurbishment of the ground floor bus waiting areas. These are some of our original models, looking at the layout of those, how we could move the furniture around, how we could open up spaces from one side to another, testing areas there. And we also looked at that. We work a lot in both hand-made models and also hand sketches to study the interior. And this was a really useful way of getting to grips with the details of the project. For example, the way the Pirelli stamped rubber flooring was laid out, the way the tiling is done, how that matches with the grid of the timber work above. And so we used the sketches to test different ideas. This was looking at how to introduce the glazed screen to separate off the 24-hour coach station, but without disrupting the flow of the concrete ribs above the head. And similarly, where we would open up views from the east side of the building to the west side to try and bring that sense of spatial coherence around the building and create new waiting areas. And finally, the cafe. This is one part you can actually see is almost exactly the same today as in the sketch, where the ramp down into the subway was closed in that allowed us to expand the cafe. But we tried to do that in a way that really felt like part of the original building. And as I said at the start, there's really a lot of details in a kind of human level in the original BDP design that is not necessarily familiar to people who haven't spent a lot of time there. So, for example, they used Iroko timber really extensively throughout the interior, which is actually a material you can't use now. It's on the red list today. It was used in the bus barriers that created the pens, also in handrails, in the doors. So we felt that that was something that was used everywhere people were touching the building directly. So that's something we've tried to carry through in the new design elements that we've introduced, but also gave us the opportunity to reuse some of that original material. And we tried to do that in various creative ways. You can see here some of the mock-ups we went through in the early stages of the process, testing different scenarios of lighting, different ways of lighting the signage, levels of transparency and so on. And then we had the idea of, even in fact at the competition stage, part of our submission, one of the ideas was to take those original timber barriers and turn them horizontally to create bench seating all the way along the west side of the building. So it would retain those original materials and use them in a new way. And this is looking then at some of the mock-ups for that seating, trying to decide whether they had backs, the angles for them, and so on. The last section here before I have a short film to show at the end, a series of photographs. These were taken by Gareth Gardner, the photographer, who's done a great job, I think, in capturing the refurbishment. So these really document the building as it was, as it finished in 2018, 2019. I was actually in Preston just a couple of weeks ago, and it's really looking good. It looks very much like this now. So that's really great to see. You can see here we're looking at the building from the east side across the bus parking, which continues to operate as where the buses enter the building. And you can see how the scale of the buses still intersect with the building at the right scale. A series of new in situ concrete pens to allow the bus to safely arrive, and people come out. The automated doors are activated by a bus arriving that allows people to safely board the vehicle. And I think the new lighting scheme is something that's really highlighted in Gareth's photographs, and is something in a really simple way that's made a huge difference to the building. It simply feels a lot safer. If you think about being in Preston in the, in the winter, it's dark, sort of 4:30, obviously. So it's quite a large period of time each day. The building's potentially pretty dark, and it just has this far more inviting feel as you look across the city centre. We don't actually have many photographs of the new public space. The main reason for that is it was finished in 2019, and before we could get Gareth to go up to photograph it again, unfortunately we ran into the pandemic. And then more recently, part of the public space to the west side of the building has been used for a very large marquee, which is used to give out vaccinations to the public. So that, I think, is really, in a way, a wonderful example of how that public space can be used for a very vital public role, although unfortunately it somewhat got in the way of our photography. This is the small taxi rank at the south of the building, which is now restored and has become used for the coaches. So this is adjacent to the interior area, the 24-hour coach station, the 4 coach bays here for coaches to pull up into. People can wait under the canopy and then move away. And you can see there, just moving slightly north, the entrance to the coach station and the beginning of what is now that public space, although at the time you just about see the construction barrier there that was still in place at the time these photos were taken. And some of the details, as I said before, the restored concrete, there's coatings now on these exposed aggregate columns, but a translucent coating so that it doesn't interrupt the original finish, and the restored, well, in fact, reinstated facade with the horizontal blue area and the new mullions and new glazing. And the automated doors that I think do give you a kind of much more seamless entry points now as you go into the building. This is the bus station concourse on the west side. So as today, if you were walking out of any of these doors, you'd walk immediately into that pedestrianised space. And I really hope here we've been able to restore the kind of grandeur and generosity, because it is really an extremely generous building, both the spirit of the original design and I think also in the way it's run and the way it's used by people in the city. Obviously people come to take a bus there, but there's a side to Preston Bus Station that's very community focused. There's hairdressers there, there's cafes, there's a travel agent, there's all kinds of different activities going on in the building. It's very open for people to come in. And now there's obviously much more space, much more seating areas and so on. This is a new build pod at the south, which brings in the information desk. We use, again, some of the Iroko to surround that. So that kind of carries through the idea of that in areas that people can touch. And again, you can see the more seamless views through between the 2 sides of the building. And up at the north end, some of these curved benches we moved from elsewhere in the building and were restored. The bases are segmented concrete, and then you have the kind of curved timber top on them. And on the east side of the building, on the inside, that's the part of the project that most clearly really reflects the original 1969 experience of being at Preston Bus Station. As you go to board your bus, you ultimately come to the small pens that divide the gate to each bus route that you're going to. The signage obviously reflects today's bus routes, but has been reinstated in the original design. And that backlit band, I think, just brings this sort of extraordinary element all the way around the building. And some of those details that I mentioned earlier, the seating that's been restored, the concrete stairs with the Iroko balustrades, and in many ways this kind of human scale of the building that I think is perhaps makes it stand out as a building of its time, even beyond the larger gestures. I think that's the last photograph. I'm just going to finish with a short video. So there's a group called Photography by Anderson who brilliantly really just went of their own initiative and made a film about the building. We've started working with them a bit since, and I just really want to show it because I think it brings across those kind of human elements and hopefully makes that sort of clear if you haven't had the chance to see the building. I hope the sound came across there.
It did, John. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, thank you.
Very good. I think we'll leave it there. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Okay, well, firstly, thank you very much, John and Christina. Fabulous talk. And also, we've had quite a lot of interest on the chat to the talks. There are a number of comments that have been made, but can I start by, I don't know if John and Christina, whether you can see the chats. I think Councillor Peter Moss has complimented you on your work, John, but he's asking about the link between the building and the city centre, asking what you could suggest to bring the two closer together. So perhaps while you just ponder that for a minute, Vicky Webster said she thinks that the building looks fab. And Jennifer Ball wonders whose design the original lettering and signage was. Was that a subcontractor to, or consultant to BDP originally, perhaps? I don't know. Angela Brady, thanks, Angela. She says, great work, John. Delighted this iconic building was saved by a fantastic and hardworking campaign. Absolutely. And Andrew Lloyd, fantastic restoration. I helped with the Save Preston Bus Station social media campaign, but back then, embarrassingly, we didn't focus on environmental factors. Well, who did? Was the embedded carbon of the building something you had to consider? And that in mind, and so many other brutalist buildings under threat, are there any deteriorating brutalist buildings that you would like to work on in the future? Well, that's a poser. For anyone interested, I'll be leading, this is from Andrew Jackson, I'll be leading a 20th Century Society Lancashire weekend with Elaine Harwood. Okay, we'd like to know more about landscape and public realm in connection to the city. This is from Simon Kahn. And from Philip Binns, excellent presentation to both speakers. Hope the webinar will be saved and made available. Yes, we hope it will. So thank you for that. I have to say, I thought it was great seeing Ian Nairn at the beginning, Christina, getting in on the action so soon after it was finished. He's a particular hero of mine. And, you know, I think he just always was a voice crying in the wilderness, but, you know, he has done such a lot for our interests, I think. So have you got any comments to make? Firstly, Councillor Moss's comment is John.
Yes. Well, there are two mentions about the landscape and the public realm connection there. So, well, Councillor Moss will know better than me, even being in Preston, that there's a sort of shared space initiative along Fishergate, which has been installed over a number of years, even before we were involved in the bus station, and then that continues around now to Lord Street and the entrance to the site there. So the sort of master plan scale of the project, the intention was that public square helps lead people through to that, and it works with the highways, the sort of wider highways program around the city centre, with you know, the sort of traffic calming and moving vehicles off into different places. Hopefully that's been broadly successful. I was up there, yeah, as I say, just very recently. It would be interesting to look at stitching it in more. I think it is definitely, the building is far more accessible than it was originally, and it is far more seamless going across to it as a member of the public than it was before.
Okay.
So I think that sort of broadly worked.
Okay. Is there anything that either of you would like to say generally about environmental factors? I mean, the fact that the building was saved rather than demolished and rebuilt in some form has got to be something in its favor in terms of, you know, its carbon, or a carbon footprint generally, I suppose. But is there a heavy carbon price to pay for this sort of work, do you think, generally? Are we doing a great service? What do you think generally? It's got to be restoration.
I mean, I think this should hopefully be a great example of how to save embodied carbon in a building. I mean, the amount of concrete that's in Preston Bus Station must represent an incredible amount of embodied carbon. As a result of this project, a lot of our work is with projects that involve existing structures that are, we look at refurbishing them and extend them. So it's quite often an existing building element and a new build element. But I think more and more, it seems obvious to look to extend the life of a building and look at how you can use the materials that are already there and how to repurpose those structures. So I think hopefully this project is a really positive environmental example, but both for the existing building, but also the public transport aspect as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, okay. The chat room is quiet at the moment, but I think that's probably the representative of the kind of the quality of the work and the way that the project's been. I think everyone is just so impressed, basically.
Could I say something?
Of course.
I'll put them on the spot, but they can hide through Zoom. But both Angela Brady and Andrew Lloyd, who commented on the chat, they were both instrumental in the campaign. And since they're here, I have to name them. Angela was the president of the RIBA at the time. She was lobbying the minister. She has been on TV programs. She was very instrumental. And Andrew Lloyd has been running the Facebook page, which again has been critical for the whole campaign. And the other person I should mention is John Wilson, because he was really pushing with the campaign. And the interesting thing that I think it's worth mentioning, even though we all here in this forum are with an architectural interest, is that John Wilson always used to say he couldn't care less about if the architecture of the building is special or if it gets listed. What he wanted was that this is a public asset that shouldn't be lost for the city. And I think this matters a lot, whether we here in this group are interested in architecture and heritage.
Okay. We've got, actually, I've just picked up a question, but while I'm looking at that, can I just ask, this building, the design for this came out of the BDP Preston office, I think, didn't it? And as such, do you think that there are any other buildings in the BDP portfolio that are, at risk? I mean, I'm thinking of the Halifax Building Society. I'm not actually, I'm from Yorkshire myself, but I'm not actually sure what has happened to that as a kind of mega structure sitting in the middle of Halifax. But are there other BDP buildings that are at risk that people know of that we need to get on the case and consider? No.
I don't know about BDP specifically.
No. Okay. Okay. Let's see, what else have we got? BDP also designed a splendid indoor market hall close to Preston Bus Station, now demolished, from Matthew Ashton. Angela Brady thanks you, Christina. She's in contact with John Wilson, campaigner today. Very pleased with the current look of the refurbishment and says people really like it. That's brilliant, isn't it? So, a very pertinent question, actually. Great presentation and project. Why did Preston need the largest bus station in the country? Are the outside curves now white? Some pictures, they look white now. How were they restored? That's from a mysterious person who calls themselves iPhone. Any comments?
Why was it? I don't know if Christina knows the history of why it was chosen for the largest bus station. I think it presumably was seen as a kind of interchange point between, going up to Scotland potentially and then for coming south in England. And certainly even today, a lot of people, the reason they've been to Preston is because they've changed, they've taken a coach to Preston and changed to get another one to go further north again. I don't know more about the history of it than that, although it is certainly, as I said, still very busy. Despite the scale of the building, there's sometimes the day you can be in there, and it's really packed. Sorry, Christine.
Sorry, you can come back to the second question, John, but on that point, I don't remember the full details, but it had to do with new towns, with the expansion of Preston becoming, I don't remember now the correct terminology, but it was specifically to do with the new motorways. I think the first motorway was passing Preston. There we are, yeah.
Yeah, somebody's put it up in the chat.
Somebody's phrasing it much better than me. So yeah, it wasn't random. It was very specific to do with wider planning and road transport.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm sure Preston is really pleased with the result of both of your efforts, and it's got a long and happy life ahead of it, and it'll contribute.
I interrupted John, though. He wanted to respond to that question about the why.
Oh, the curved parapets. So there's a anti-carbonization coating being put on the concrete to stop further erosion of the rebar under the surface, is what the coating is. So those sort of curved parapets, they were in all kinds of different states at the beginning of the project in 2015. So some of them had been painted, some of them were exposed, some of them were badly degraded. There's kind of a whole patchwork. So ultimately, they were all kind of sprayed off, and the solution was to use the consistent coating across all of them, which what gives it the kind of consistency that it is now.
Okay. Oh, I've got some more questions, actually. What's happened here? Right, I think that's basically restated what's already been described. Yeah, okay. I think that's great, actually. Thank you. So I think we're probably just about there, actually. It's been a really satisfactory evening, and thank you very much for coming to talk to us tonight. I mean, Christina, I just really admired your rigor, your determination, and your detail in the process of getting this listed. And I think that obviously it's a major achievement when others before you had failed. And John, well, young, new, talented kid on the block. It's great. I really, these competitions they just bring new faces out. And it's wonderful when that happens. And, I just really look forward to seeing more of your work, because, you've brought a human face to the building, the detail of the research, the sensitive way in which you did the restoration and the interventions. But, you really kind of gave a respect to the stylistic kind of values that BDP had put into the scheme originally in '69. So I think we actually really love this sort of very daring fairy tale that you've described here today. It's sort of take my breath away, the way it's actually was destined to die, and here it is, a sort of living, breathing thing contributing to the life of Preston. So thank you very, very much indeed. It's been a great talk. And I hope that, we can keep an eye on both your work and both your developments. Just before I finish the meeting, though, can I just say a little bit about our next programme? We've just recently completed a series of talks that we were running in the autumn and last week on pre-war émigré pioneer architects. And we're now looking at the post-war period, looking at architects whose work effectively sought to match that of the pre-war émigrés and also of their own particular contemporaries. We've got a talk on Dennis Lasden penciled in, and we've got a talk on Peter Morrow penciled in. We are working on the programme, but we'd love to have all of the audience here tonight come along to our talks. So please watch this space, keep an eye on our website, and we'll welcome you either live at the gallery or in Zoomland at some future date very, very soon. Anyway, thank you very much to our speakers. If you could unmute yourselves, could we give them a big round of applause, please, which they deserve. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And catch up with you both soon. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to close the meeting now.